So my name is Matt Fisher. I'm a chemistry professor at St. Vincent College. I'm also a senior fellow with the National Center for Science and Civic Engagement. And what I want to talk with you a little bit about today is the scholarship of teaching and learning, which is something that the wider SENCER community has been very interested in and engaged with for a number of years. And really what the scholarship of teaching and learning is about is inquiring into our students' learning, the name of this presentation. So let me start by looking at two complementary ways of describing what characterizes the scholarship of teaching and learning. One view, articulated by Lee Shulman back in 2000, is that the scholarship of teaching and learning, like any other form of scholarship, is work that's made public. It's work that is used as an object of critical review and evaluation by others in the community. And finally, members of the community begin to use, build upon, and develop the work that has been made public. And all of this is consistent with something that Shulman has long argued for, and that is the critical importance of making teaching community property rather than a private, individualized, isolated practice. Another way of describing what characterizes the scholarship of teaching and learning comes from two of Shulman's colleagues, Mary Huber and Pat Hutchings, who in their 2005 book, The Advancement of Learning, described the scholarship of teaching and learning as being characterized first and foremost by questioning, second by gathering and exploring evidence, third trying out and refining new insights, and finally going public. And Huber and Hutchings emphasized that those middle elements of gathering and exploring evidence, as well as the trying out and refining new insights, sometimes can overlap. And so this is one of the things that makes the scholarship of teaching and learning perhaps a little bit different from discipline-based education research, which has been the subject of a recent report from the National Research Council. Sometimes the phrase scholarly teaching is used, and I wanted to take a moment and give a sense of how scholarly teaching and the scholarship of teaching and learning complement each other. Scholarly teaching is often described as an individual faculty member being aware of the literature on teaching and learning in their discipline, using that information, using those insights, using new pedagogies in order to improve the learning environment that he or she is creating for their students, and then finally using various types of assessment and evaluative tools in order to gather information about how students are doing in order to improve that individual faculty member's own practice. From my perspective, the big difference between scholarly teaching and the scholarship of teaching and learning is the element of going public. Scholarly teaching is what really good faculty members oftentimes are engaged in order to improve their own practice. But I do think it's important to recognize at the outset that there isn't a hierarchy here where one is better than the other. It's not that scholarship of teaching and learning is better than scholarly teaching. They're just slightly different perspectives on this very complex process that we call teaching and learning. As with any other form of scholarship, the scholarship of teaching and learning is going to be characterized by the standards of scholarly work. You see them listed here in this slide, and from our own disciplinary experiences, these are standards that all of us are familiar with and recognize the importance of. The same standards apply for the scholarship of teaching and learning. The difference is the details in how they play out. What are the specific methods that may be appropriate for a particular project, a particular question? What's the literature that would be part of that adequate presentation? Sometimes it's the nature of the results, and we'll talk about the types of evidence that are often used in scholarship of teaching and learning a little bit later in this session. There are a variety of genres of the scholarship of teaching and learning. You see them listed here. This is a very nice list from Craig Nelson, who retired from Indiana University in Bloomington after many years of being engaged in the scholarship of teaching and learning. I'm not going to go through each of these genres individually. The only point that I want to make is you'll see towards the bottom of the slide the listing for formal research. In my own experience, I've often seen the misconception on the part of faculty who are new to the scholarship of teaching and learning that, oh, the scholarship of teaching and learning has to be a formal research project like what many of us think of when we hear the phrase educational research. And that is in fact not the case. There are a variety of genres. They each have their own strengths. They each have their own limitations. What genre is best for a particular faculty member to focus on? That will depend on the nature of the question and the nature of the project. There's no way to decide that at the outset. So, how do I or any other faculty member start in terms of engaging with the scholarship of teaching and learning? The answer to that is actually very simple, with a question. Okay. And so what I want to do is take a few minutes and look a little bit more closely at how we can, as faculty members, can develop questions related to our students' learning that would be appropriate and good to investigate. So we're going to look at how we can frame the question. What you see on this slide is a quote from a wonderful essay by Randy Bass at Georgetown called The Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, What's the Problem? If you Google that phrase, you'll find several websites where you can get the full text of the essay, and I highly, highly recommend reading it from start to finish. The part that I want to focus on is the part that I've highlighted in red, where Bass wrote, changing the status of the problem in teaching from terminal remediation to ongoing investigation is precisely what the movement for scholarship of teaching is all about. How might we make the problematization of teaching a matter of regular communal discourse? How might we think of teaching practice and the evidence of student learning as problems to be investigated, analyzed, represented, and debated? And what Bass touches on here is actually a key point in terms of framing the question, and that is thinking about what are those things that are problems in teaching and learning. We know from our own disciplinary experiences that we talk to our colleagues and we ask them, what research problem are you working on? What challenge, what question are you exploring? And Bass is really advocating that we do the same thing with teaching and learning. So what can we ask a question about? Could be something that puzzles you about student learning. It could be something that is important to your work as a teacher and interesting to you and your colleagues. So just to give you an example from my own discipline, over a number of years of teaching general chemistry, it's become clear to me and my colleagues at St. Vincent that one of the key things that's important for a student not only to be successful in general chemistry, but to be successful in terms of moving forward is their ability to start to visualize things at a molecular level. And so that's something that's very important to us. How can we help students develop that ability to visualize processes at a molecular level? As I said, every discipline, every course, every curriculum has issues like that. Okay. There's several different types of questions. Taxonomy that I really like was one developed by Pat Hutchings back around 2000. And I want to go through these very quickly in the sense of just giving people a sense of the range of questions that can be the focus of the scholarship of teaching and learning, where most faculty members naturally start, and where what many faculty members that I've talked to think is the focus of the scholarship of teaching and learning is the first type of question, a what works, or what's oftentimes really phrased as a what works better. And that certainly is a valid question to ask, but in many cases, and my own experience has certainly mirrored this, what comes up and what becomes really the initial question to ask is not a what works better question, but what is blank? What are students capable of doing, or what is the student understanding of information literacy as junior chemistry majors? What is the ability of students to look at mathematical data and determine trends? Right? So this isn't a question of what works better. This is really simply exploring in more depth what is some particular aspect of student learning. It could be a skill, it could be a concept that may then open up ideas and suggest possibilities for what might work better. A third type of question that Hutchings described is what she called the vision of the possible. And this is perhaps a little bit more theoretically oriented, but sometimes just as important as the first two questions, which I think many faculty would see as being much more clearly grounded in what actually happens in the classroom. And then a final type of question is a new model or a new way of understanding practice, a new way of looking at what people have been doing, what faculty and students have been doing in the classroom in order to understand that practice in a way that might open up new possibilities. The next slide shows you a schematic of one way of thinking of the relationships between these different types of questions. So what works is really a measure of efficacy. What is an examination of process. Both of those are very much questions that stay inside the box that's already been defined. What's possible is now starting to explore outside the box, and then stepping outside the circle and coming at it from a different perspective oftentimes opens up the opportunity to ask questions about what unifies. And that can involve defining models, conceptual frameworks that will give faculty members and students a new perspective on the work of teaching and learning. So let me give you a specific example that you can see how a particular teaching problem actually has embedded in it several different questions. So one of the courses I teach at St. Vincent is organic chemistry. One of the things that I know is that students struggle to organize the concepts in the course in a way that leads to success on exams. And so in reading articles and talking with other faculty members, it became clear to me that having students reflect on their exam performance after the exam is returned in some systematic way might be helpful in terms of giving students a better sense of how they've organized concepts and how they've studied, what's worked for them, what hasn't worked, what they might want to change. And so what I decided to do was to have students complete a post-exam reflection, what's called an exam wrapper. And if you Google the phrase exam wrapper, you'll find resources out on the web about that. After each of the first 3 exams in the course, the 4th exam is literally right at the end of the semester before the final, and so there really wasn't the time to do that. So given that decision to have students complete a post-exam reflection, here's several different investigations that suggested themselves to me. The first one is simply, how do students react to using these reflections? Do they see them as valuable? Do they see them as a waste of time? Do they have mixed feelings about them? Do those reactions change throughout the course of the semester? The second question is not so much about student reaction, but looking at the student responses. Do the student responses to those reflection questions change during the course of the semester as they engage in this process several times? Does the way in which they think about each of the questions change in a way that I could perhaps track? And the third question, because the exam wrappers that I was using had a mixture of both general questions as well as ones that were specific to organic chemistry, the third possible investigation would be, how do students respond to course-specific reflection questions? Is there a difference between the way that students reflect on how they did on an exam when you give them very general prompts in terms of looking at things that they did to prepare and where they had difficulty, versus course-specific responses such as how comfortable do you feel in terms of recognizing certain types of chemical structures? How comfortable do you feel in terms of carrying out certain skills that are very specific to organic chemistry? So one decision, 3 possible investigations, certainly some overlap between them, but these investigations that I've listed here are not all exactly the same. The next slide gives you a partial list, a very partial list, of some of the scholarship and teaching learning questions that have been asked by faculty in the SENCER community. How does concept mapping impact learning in a biology course? The impact of interactive demonstrations on non-science majors in a biology course, the use of online homework in a physics course. The last question listed here really focused on a subpopulation of students who seem to be doing very well in the course mid-semester, but at some point between mid-semester and end of the semester, stopped attending classes and eventually failed the course. And this particular faculty member was interested in trying to understand what characteristics might be useful in terms of identifying students who might end up in this category so that she could be proactive in taking interventions. Okay. So let me now walk through 2 different ways of developing a question. The first way is really to start with a learning goal you have for students. So many of us now are engaged in defining learning outcomes for particular courses or learning outcomes for a curriculum. Those learning outcomes can be thought of as goals. And then when you've got that goal and when you have a succinct summary of that goal, then you can ask what evidence would reveal that the goal was achieved. And that question then would start you thinking about what investigations could you carry out that would contribute towards providing you with the evidence that would reveal that the goal was achieved. The other way of thinking about developing a question is not to start with a defined learning outcome, but starting with some issue that's important in your own teaching, something problematic, something challenging, something that you or your colleagues see as important to understand in order to help your students do well. And in that case, there's a couple of things that are important to ask yourself at the outset. First is the issue investigable? Does it lend itself to investigation, or is it something that you really don't have any way to investigate? Is it bounded and well-defined? The more bounded, the more well-defined the issue, the better position you will be in terms of developing a way to investigate that. Is the issue significant? Not statistically, not in a statistical sense, but in terms of its importance to a community of learners or to a particular discipline. And then as you've worked through these, and really the point of the first few bullet points here is to ensure that the issue that you're thinking of really is feasible, is workable to investigate in a scholarship of teaching and learning project. And then the final bullet point is simply to say, okay, now what are some questions related to this issue that could be investigated? So those are just two different ways, complementary ways of developing a question that serves as the starting point for your investigation. Once you have the question, then you have to think about what type of evidence would make sense. Certainly as an undergraduate science professor, one of the things that I've seen with faculty members from a variety of STEM disciplines is the automatic assumption that the evidence has to be quantitative, it has to be amenable to statistical analysis in order for it to be viewed as valid. And the first thing that I want to say about evidence is that there are multiple forms of evidence. I'll repeat that again because it's a really key point. There are multiple forms of evidence. What's the best form of evidence for your particular project? That's going to depend on the nature of the question. And so you see here a list of, and it's really a partial list of things that can be used as evidence. Evidence can be student work on assignments and exams. Certainly one thing that has helped with using student work has been the large number of rubrics, the increased activity in terms of developing well-designed rubrics that a number of faculty are engaged in. Some of you may be familiar with the classroom assessment techniques that were compiled by Angelo and Cross in the book of the same name. There's over 50 techniques there. They give very nice directions for how to use those techniques in a classroom and some suggestions for how to go about analyzing the evidence that's provided. Surveys can be a form of evidence. The student assessment of learning gains is an example of a survey where there's been an enormous amount of work that has gone into establishing the validity, the reliability of that particular instrument. Interviews, focus groups, documenting activity during class, either with video or audio recording. Think alouds, some of you may be familiar with those. Those are where you will put students in situations and then ask them to say aloud everything that they're thinking as they work through a particular problem or scenario. There's a lot of literature in the area of trying to understand what distinguishes experts and novices where think alouds have been used. And then knowledge surveys where you list a number of different elements of a course, a number of different topics, and you ask students to self-identify their confidence in dealing with many of those topics. And again, a lot of work has been done to demonstrate the correlation between student response on knowledge surveys and student performance on exams. So this is just a partial list of some of the forms of evidence that can be worked with in the scholarship of teaching and learning. Some of the forms of evidence listed on the previous slide are qualitative. Some of the forms of evidence are quantitative. The important thing to realize is that each form of evidence has its own strengths and its own limitations. There should not be an automatic privileging of one form of evidence over the other. It depends on the nature of the discipline and the sorts of things that that discipline asks students to do. It depends on the nature of the question. Questions that are related to changes in student understanding and conceptualization. Sometimes qualitative evidence can be much, much richer in that regard. And there are ways to take qualitative evidence, student writing, student responses to questions in interview settings. There are ways to take that and start to develop some quantitative measures. How frequently do students use certain terms? How frequently they use certain phrases or say certain things? And that analysis of qualitative evidence is something that could be the focus of a separate seminar by itself. It's not always necessary or possible to have a control group. The analogy that I like is one that Spencer Benson, who's a biologist at the University of Maryland, has used. He makes the analogy that the scholarship of teaching and learning in some ways is very much like ecological fieldwork, and sometimes it's not possible to have a control group. That doesn't automatically invalidate the scholarship. In many ways, that depends on the nature of the question. Certainly, if you are investigating a question that falls into the what works better category, then having a control group becomes critically important. So just keep that in mind, that it really depends on the nature of the question, whether or not having a control is absolutely necessary for the project to continue. Remember that the scholarship of teaching and learning, we're dealing with students who are human subjects, and that means that faculty engaged in this work need to be aware of the importance of institutional review boards, and you need to talk to the institutional review board at your institution. While there are provisions in federal law to exempt some things from detailed review and approval by institutional review boards, and that is typically work that students would be doing anyway for the class, I cannot stress enough the importance of talking to the head of the IRB at your institution, because it is that IRB that will make the decisions for your institution, what's exempt, what's not exempt, what can get expedited review, what requires full review. So they have the final word. You need to talk to them. And for me to say anything more really would not be useful, helpful, or appropriate, because each IRB will take its own institutional context into account. Finally, it's always good to collect lots of data, but as we know from our disciplinary work, sometimes we can drown in data. So it's also important to think about a strategy for analysis so that you don't end up in a situation where you have so much data that you don't know where to start and which way is up. So we've talked about framing the question. We've talked very briefly about evidence. The last thing that I want to look at for a couple of minutes is the existing literature and venues for going public. So as you are making your work public, and these are actually things that are good to think about even in the early stages of your project, and that is, first, what's the connection between your work and any theory or conceptual framework? And that really then flows into the second bullet point. What's the connection to? How can your project build on existing literature? Personally, I've seen too many scholarship of teaching and learning projects that were done in something of a vacuum, where there's very little in the way of connections to existing literature, building on existing literature, where appropriate, building on relevant theories or conceptual frameworks. That isn't consistent with the standards of scholarly work that we talked about, or that we looked at earlier. One of the points was adequate preparation. That means that for each of us, and I struggle with this as much as anyone does, finding the time to read the literature in some systematic way becomes really important. We know it's a struggle in terms of reading our own disciplinary literature. I'm not saying that it's easy in terms of the scholarship of teaching and learning, but it is important that we try to set aside a little bit of time on a regular basis to be able to read what's out there in the existing literature that's relevant to our project so that we can make the connection, so that we can build on that existing literature and end up making public work that is richer, more connected, more thought-provoking, and oftentimes more valuable in the eyes of our colleagues. They find it much more useful in their own projects. And then finally, something to consider as you make your work public is assessment of effectiveness, if that's relevant for the question that you're working with. There are a variety of ways to make work in the scholarship of teaching and learning public. Certainly one way is peer-reviewed journals. There are a number of disciplinary-based journals. In my own discipline, there is the Journal of Chemical Education, which has been published for over 75 years. The Royal Society of Chemistry has a journal, Chemistry Education, Research and Practice. Those are both very, very well-regarded places to publish. There are journals in physics. There are journals in biology. CBE, Life Science Education, is the one that comes to mind. You can find listings of disciplinary-based journals that are focused on the scholarship of teaching and learning and discipline-based education research. There are several libraries out there that have public web pages that list those journals, and so if you Google that, you should be able to come across those. Second category of peer-reviewed journals are journals that are explicitly focused on the scholarship of teaching and learning. Mountain Rise is an example out of Western Carolina University, the International Journal for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning at Georgia Southern, a new one that has now been published for about the past 1.5 to 2 years is Teaching and Learning Inquiry, which is sponsored by the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. These are journals that are very much multidisciplinary, so they won't have articles just from the sciences or just from the humanities, but from a variety of disciplines. And some really interesting work gets published there. And there's a different audience that looks at those journals than, in some cases, the readers for the discipline-based journals. Finally, in terms of the SENCER community, there is our own journal, Science Education and Civic Engagement, an international journal. You can find a link to that on the SENCER website. And that journal is interested in submissions from a variety of disciplines, a variety of levels, teacher preparation, K-12, undergraduate, that share the common element of focusing on science, education, and some dimension of civic engagement. And the journal website will give you a sense of the different types of submissions they accept, the short project reports, the longer research articles. Another way of publishing your work is to submit an article about it to newsletters like the Teaching Professor, the National Teaching and Learning Forum. While these are not peer-reviewed in the classic sense of submissions are sent out to reviewers for their input, I can tell you from having worked with both editors that the editors at both of these newsletters are not interested in publishing work that is mediocre. They receive far more submissions than they can publish. They probably only publish maybe 20% or so of their submissions. And so this is certainly a way of making your work public that I think is very valuable to keep in mind. Work can be made public also through the web, whether that be a public website for something that you may have developed as part of your project or resources that you've assembled. There's also a very nice website, courseportfolio.org, that was developed by the Peer Review of Teaching Project based for a number of years at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And that is now set up where individuals can create course portfolios online that are public for other faculty to view and to leave comments for. You can also make your work in the scholarship of teaching and learning public in a variety of different conference presentations. So there are disciplinary societies, the ones that I've listed there. The acronyms are the American Chemical Society, the American Society for Microbiology, the American Physical Society, American Society for Engineering Education. FASEB is the umbrella organization that sponsors the Experimental Biology meeting, which has an education track in it. The American Association of Physiology Teachers, or Physics Teachers, I'm sorry. The SENCER Summer Institute is another conference where there are both oral presentations as well as poster presentations for work that people have done in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. There's also conferences like the Lilly Conference that's been around for over 30 years. And there are now several Lilly conferences held around the country that have long focused on making the work that faculty are doing public and allowing faculty from a variety of disciplines to share the work that they've been doing in terms of investigating some aspect of teaching and learning. Another conference that's been around probably now for at least a decade is the Teaching Professor Conference. Teaching Professor Conference, Lilly conferences are multidisciplinary conferences. So there you're talking in front of an audience that may have people from several different disciplines there. And sometimes the feedback that you get, the questions that are asked in an environment like that, very, very different and very valuable from what you would encounter at a presentation at a disciplinary society meeting. And then finally, the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning sponsors an annual conference. That conference is oftentimes, although not always, held in North America. In 2014, it's going to be held in Montreal. I believe in 2015, it's held in Australia. But that is a conference now that has been in existence for about 10 years. That also can be a very valuable venue for making the work public. So hopefully what we've done in about the past half hour is given you a little bit better sense of how you can begin to engage in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. I want to take a moment and acknowledge several groups that have been key resources in terms of some of the ideas and things that have been part of this webinar. The Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and in particular senior staff there, and the 2005 cohort of Carnegie Scholars were really instrumental in a lot of the understanding of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning that I've shared with you today. Spencer Benson at Maryland, Jackie Dewar and Curtis Bennett, who are mathematicians at Loyola Marymount University in Southern California, have also been very helpful colleagues. And finally, the larger SENCER community have also been very helpful to me as well in terms of their own questions and the things that they have wanted to know about how to engage in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. So I wish you well as you start to consider engaging in this work, and I hope you find it as rewarding as I have for more than the past decade.